Gym slang you should know, the shit no one talks about. Let's talk about it.
Don't you want to look good naked?
So let's go over some terms and some slang that you might hear and might be like, what the heck does that mean? So I'm gonna clear that up for you in this video. Sets and reps, what do those mean? Let's take an example. So if you see in your programming something that says 3 by 10 or 4 by 8 to 12, the first number is gonna be the amount of sets you're doing, and the second numbers are going to be the reps. So if it's 3 sets of 10, that's gonna be 3 sets of 10 reps. So you'll do your first set, which is gonna be 10 reps. You'll do your second set, 10 reps, your third set, 10 reps, and that is 3 sets of 10. You might also hear people say the word load. That just means the amount of weight that you're using, whether that's a cable machine weight or a barbell weight or a dumbbell weight or the plate weight on a barbell squat. So load is just think the amount of weight that you're using for that exercise. 1 RM, that just refers to your 1 rep max, and that is the maximal amount of weight that you can lift for a specific movement at one time. Pump. That's just what occurs when you're feeling your muscles getting super tight, and what's happening there is metabolites are building up within that. So things like you might have heard the word lactate or metabolic byproducts. That just means that you're creating a lot of blood flow within that muscle tissue, and so as you're working out, you're getting that pump or that tightness within your muscle. Supersets. Supersets is just combining 2 exercises back to back, whether or not that's exercises from the same muscle group, so agonist supersets, or exercises from opposing muscle groups. That would be antagonist supersets. So an example of an agonist superset would be 2 movements where you're training your biceps. An example of an antagonist superset would be maybe a quad and a hamstring superset. Knee flexion and knee extension. So knee flexion is just when you're bending your knee or you're closing the gap between your hamstring and your calf. And knee extension is the opposite, so when you're extending your knee straight. Hip flexion and hip extension. So hip flexion is just when you're bending at the hip, and you can think about closing that gap between your upper thigh and your stomach. Hip extension is when you're extending your leg backwards or you're extending your hip backwards behind you. Shoulder flexion and extension. Shoulder flexion is when you're bringing your arm up as much as you can overhead. Shoulder extension is when you're extending your arm back behind you as much as you can. Supination and pronation. Supination is when you have your palms up, so think about holding a bowl of soup. And pronation is the opposite, when your palms are facing down towards the floor. A abduction versus a deduction. So if you've ever heard those terms, or you've ever heard someone refer to the good girl, bad girl machine at the gym, the good girl machine is the adduction, so you're bringing your legs towards your midline, right? So you're adding to your midline. I like to think about that, a deduction adding. And then a abduction would be the bad girl. So you're spreading your legs out. That's a abduction. So just think good girl is a deduction and bad girl is a abduction. Hip dominant versus knee dominant. So if you ever hear these different terms, hip dominant is focused on hip flexion and extension. So think about closing the gap between your thigh and your stomach for that hip flexion and extending your leg behind you for that hip extension. So those are gonna be more so your glute focused movements, your hamstring focused movements. That's if you hear hip dominant, it's gonna be referred to more so those glute movements or those hamstring movements. Versus a knee dominant movement is primarily focused on the quads or bending and extending at your knee. So closing the gap between your calf and your hamstrings. Unilateral versus bilateral. Unilateral just means single arm or leg, and bilateral just means both arms and legs. Resistance profile. So this term just refers to where the exercise is the hardest. So when you're performing an exercise, think about where do I feel the most tension? That's going to be what is referred to as the resistance profile of that exercise. Concentric versus eccentric. Concentric is the shortening of the muscle or the contracting portion of the lift, versus eccentric is the lowering portion or the lengthening portion of the lift. Tempo. Tempo just refers to how fast you're performing a rep or how long you're under tension or time under tension. Kind of the same thing. So if we are reading tempo, it's typically written with 4 numbers. The first number is always going to be the eccentric portion of the lift, so the lowering portion. The second number is going to be the pause after the eccentric. The third number is going to be the concentric portion of the lift, or the lifting portion of the lift. And the fourth number is going to be the pause after the concentric. Trisets and giant sets. So trisets are just performing 3 exercises back to back, and a giant set is just performing anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 exercises back to back. RIR and RPE. So these are scales that we use to gauge how close we are to failure when we're performing a specific lift. So RIR just stands for reps in reserve, or you can just think of how many reps do I have left in the tank before I hit failure. RPE is an opposite scale, and it stands for rate of perceived exertion, and that is just another form of understanding how much effort you're perceiving during that lift. So the RPE scale is going to be from 1 to 10, and the RIR scale is going to be from 10 to 1. Drop set. Drop set is just an intensification technique that allows you to extend a set past failure. So if you fail at a certain amount, you can either drop the weight or change the position of your body to continue that set until you get to failure again. If there's any other terms or slang that you don't know, hit me up in the comments and I'll hook you up.